Luke sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the cold, cracked floor beneath his bare feet. Around him, the other slaves settled into their thin, scratchy bedding, their hollow faces turned away, their whispers drowned out by the rattling chains hanging from the walls. Jake was pacing again, his footsteps agitated and loud enough to draw annoyed glances. He clenched and unclenched his fists, his frustration palpable. "You're going to wear a hole in the floor," Luke muttered, rubbing his temples. Jake turned sharply, his voice low but filled with intensity. "We can't keep doing this, Luke. Day in, day out, letting them bleed us dry. We're just waiting to die." Luke sighed, leaning back against the wall. "You think I don't know that? But rushing headfirst into an escape isn't bravery, it's stupidity. We don't have a plan, Jake. No tools, no information, nothing." Jake's eyes burned with fury. "So what? You want to rot here until they throw your lifeless body into the fire pits? Because that's all we're heading toward." Luke stayed silent, his jaw tightening. Jake sat down across from him, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We need more people. They're not just going to let us waltz out of here. If we find other slaves who know things we don't, maybe we stand a chance." Luke shook his head. "More people means more risk. Someone talks, we're dead before we even start." Jake leaned in closer. "And what about her? You think she deserves to stay here? You think she'll survive another year with that monster draining her dry?" Luke froze. The image of her haunted him, the way her green eyes had locked onto his during the vaccinations, the desperation in her whispered plea for help. He didn't want to admit it, but Jake was right. Still, his voice came out firm. "She's a liability, Jake. Bringing her along would paint a target on all of us. If we're caught, it won't just be the guards. Every vampire in this mansion will be hunting us down." Jake scoffed. "You don't think they'll hunt us anyway? What's the difference?" A voice from the shadows cut through their argument. "The difference is numbers." Luke and Jake turned to see a wiry figure stepping into the dim torchlight. It was Elias, one of the quieter slaves who kept to himself. His sunken eyes gleamed with sharp intelligence, his gaunt face betraying a calculating mind. Elias crossed his arms, his tone calm but edged with mockery. "You take her with you, and you might as well hang a bell around your necks. They'll never stop hunting. But a few ragged slaves? They might not bother wasting the effort. They've got hundreds more where we came from." Jake stood, squaring up to Elias. "And who asked you?" Elias didn't flinch, his smirk widening. "No one. But I hear things. And I can think something you two seem to struggle with. You're not getting out of here without a plan. And you sure as hell won't do it alone." Luke frowned, studying Elias. "Why would you help us?" Elias shrugged. "Because you're idiots, and you'll get yourselves killed if someone doesn't step in. I'm not strong, but I'm smart. Smarter than both of you put together. And trust me, brains matter more than brawn when it comes to slipping through cracks." Jake looked ready to argue, but Luke raised a hand, silencing him. "What do you want in return?" Elias's smirk faded, his expression darkening. "The same thing you do. Freedom. But I'll tell you this, if you're taking her, count me out. She's a death sentence." Jake glared, but before he could reply, Luke spoke. "We'll think about it." Elias nodded, retreating back into the shadows. "Do that. Just don't take too long. Your window's closing faster than you think." The dorm fell silent again, the weight of the conversation hanging over them like a shroud. Jake climbed into his bunk, his anger still simmering, but Luke remained seated, staring into the darkness. His mind drifted back to a memory he had tried to bury, the day the vampires came for his family. He had been 10 years old, hiding under the kitchen table as his mother, father, and older sister were dragged into the living room. He had watched, trembling and powerless, as they were ripped apart limb by limb, their screams echoing in his ears. Blood pooled across the floor, staining the pristine carpet as the vampires fed. When they finally found him, he hadn't even screamed. He'd been too numb, too broken. Now the memory didn't bring fear or sadness. It brought a cold, burning resolve. He wouldn't let that happen again. Not to Jake, not to her, not to anyone. For the first time, the idea of escape didn't feel like a distant, impossible dream. It felt necessary. The summons came unexpectedly late in the night. The vampire escort was silent. his footsteps echoing ominously in the halls as he led Luke through the labyrinthine mansion. The destination, however, was unmistakable: Malric's chambers. When Luke entered, the room radiated quiet menace. The walls were lined with ancient tomes, their spines gilded with symbols that seemed to shift under the flickering firelight. At the center, behind a massive desk, sat Malric. He exuded a regal calm, his crimson gaze sharp enough to strip away lies. "Ah, the bold one," Malric said smoothly, motioning for Luke to sit. Luke obeyed, gripping the edge of his chair to steady himself. "I understand you've been restless," Malric began, his voice like velvet over steel. Such a dangerous quality. Restlessness. It can lead to hope, rebellion, even ruin. "Tell me, Luke, what is it you hope to gain?" Luke hesitated, weighing his words. "To leave this place alive," he said finally. "Alive." Malric let the word linger, his lips curving into a faint smile. "An ambitious goal. And what of those you leave behind? Are they worth sacrificing for your freedom?" Luke's fists clenched. "If I stay, I'll die. So will they. At least outside, we have a chance." Malric rose, circling Luke with a predator's grace. "A chance," he echoed, his voice quieter. "And do you understand the weight of what you ask? Freedom is never without cost." He stopped behind Luke, placing a cold hand on his shoulder. "But perhaps you already know that. Let's see." A flash of silver caught Luke's eye as Malric drew a slender blade and pricked his wrist. Blood welled up, and Malric dipped his finger into it, bringing it to his lips. His eyes flared with crimson light as he tasted the blood. "Defiance," Malric murmured, his voice barely audible. "Grief, pain, and hope. Such dangerous emotions." He leaned closer, his voice like a whisper in Luke's ear. "I'll offer you this. My help, but only so far. Your actions are yours alone. And remember, what you think is freedom may bring ruin to others." Luke turned to meet Malric's gaze, his voice steady. "I'll bear that weight." Malric's smile widened, though it did not reach his eyes. "Good, now go. And tread carefully, Luke. Ripples can become waves." Jake was summoned under far less ominous circumstances, though his task was no less grim. The head slave handed him a bowl of tepid water and a rag. "Room 5. The pets barely holding together. Clean her up." When he stepped into the room, the sight stopped him cold. The green-eyed pet sat by the corner of the bed, her hair disheveled and face pale. Her exposed arms bore fresh bruises and welts, a cruel reminder of her place in the mansion. On the mattress behind her lay another woman, her condition far worse. Jake hesitated, his throat dry. "I don't bother," the pet said flatly, her voice brittle. "It's not like anyone cares." Jake knelt by the other woman, dipping the rag into the water. "What's her name?" The pet watched him closely, her green eyes hard. "Why does it matter?" "It matters," Jake said firmly, his voice quiet. The pet hesitated before replying. "Lexi." Jake nodded, wiping Lexi's face gently. She groaned softly, her lips moving but no words forming. The pet crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. "Have you decided yet?" Jake glanced at her. "Decided what?" "On helping us," she said bluntly. "Her and me. We're running out of time." Jake didn't respond immediately, focusing instead on Lexi's wounds. Finally, he said, "I care about you." The pet snorted, her lips twisting into a bitter smile. "You don't even know me." "Then tell me," Jake said, looking up at her. The pet's eyes narrowed. "Why? So you can pretend we're equals? You think knowing my name will change anything?" "Maybe," Jake said simply. For a long moment she stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Maria," she said finally. Jake repeated it softly, as if committing it to memory. "Maria, don't say it like it means something," she snapped, though her voice faltered. "Names don't matter here." Back in the dormitory, Jake paced like a caged animal while Luke sat stiffly on his bunk. The tension between them was palpable. "She wants us to take Lexi," Jake blurted, stopping abruptly. Luke's head snapped up, his face darkening. "Absolutely not! She's dying," Jake shot back. We can't just leave her. You're asking us to carry dead weight, Luke hissed. Do you even understand what you're risking? She's not dead weight. Jake's voice rose, though he quickly lowered it, glancing toward the door. She's one of us. No, she's not, Luke said coldly. She's a pet. You don't see it because you're too close, but taking her is suicide. Jake stepped closer, his fists clenched. You're the one who went to Malric for help. What gives you the right to decide who we leave behind? Luke shot to his feet, his voice low and furious. Because I'm thinking with my head, not my heart. Do you think Malric will save us if we start dragging along every lost cause? Jake flinched at the mention of Malric. What did he say? Luke hesitated, then sighed. He said he'd help, but only so far. He's testing me, Jake. Testing us. And he made it clear every action has consequences. Jake stared at him, his jaw tightening. And you trust him? No, Luke admitted. But we don't have a choice. Jake fell silent, the weight of their predicament settling heavily between them. From the shadows, a pair of ears listened intently, a sly grin spreading across unseen lips. The air in the dorm was thick with tension, a stifling silence interrupted only by the distant clinking of chains and the muffled cries of the punished. Luke sat against the cold stone wall, his arms folded, staring at the flickering lantern hanging from the ceiling. Jake paced the length of the room, his fists clenched, his face shadowed with frustration. So, that's it? Jake finally snapped. You're just gonna stand there glaring at me like I'm the problem? Luke didn't respond immediately, his jaw tightening. Taking the pet is already a risk, Jake. But her friend? That's on you. Jake stopped pacing and turned to face him, his voice rising. We're already neck-deep in this. What difference does one more make? You saw what they did to her friend. Lexi's on her last legs, Luke. They'll kill her. And that's exactly the point, Luke shot back, his voice sharp. She's weak, Jake. She's a liability. If she can't keep up, I'll carry her if I have to. Jake interrupted, his voice breaking. I'm not leaving them behind. Either we're all free, or what's the damn point? Luke exhaled slowly, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. Fine, but if it falls apart because of them, the consequences are on your head, not mine. Jake's expression softened slightly, but the tension between them lingered. They're not just pets, Luke, they're people, just like us. Luke's gaze flickered towards a small barred window high on the wall. No, not like us, we're slaves, they're something else. The following evening, as the dorm quieted and the slaves settled into uneasy sleep, Elias crept closer to where Luke and Jake sat whispering in the shadows. His wiry frame moved with practiced caution, his sharp eyes flickering with curiosity. Still talking about that, are you? Elias asked, his voice low but tinged with amusement. Luke stiffened, but Jake leaned forward, his tone defensive. What do you mean, still? You've been eavesdropping again. Elias smirked, unbothered. Hard not to when you're as loud as a pair of drunken guards. But I have some information that might be useful. Jake exchanged a wary glance with Luke, who nodded begrudgingly. Go on. Elias crouched beside them, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I've been hearing things. The guards, they're not as careful as they think. They talk when they think no one's listening. One of them mentioned the feral prison. Luke frowned. What about it? They're renovating it, Elias continued. It's not secure right now. Apparently, it's been a mess for weeks. If you're planning something, that might be your way out. Jake's brow furrowed. And what the hell is a feral prison? Elias's expression darkened, and he glanced over his shoulder as though expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. It's where they keep the ones who lose control, the ones who don't feed for too long. They go feral, mindless, monstrous things that only care about blood. Luke's stomach churned. Why haven't we heard about this before? Elias smirked. Because they don't want you to know. If you knew how much they need us, you'd realize they're just as vulnerable as we are. Maybe more. The weight of Elias's words hung in the air, and for a moment none of them spoke. Finally, Jake broke the silence. So, they're just animals if they don't drink? Worse than animals, Elias replied. From what I've heard, They don't care who they kill, human or vampire. They'll tear through anything until they fed. It's why the renovations are taking so long. They're scared of what happens if something breaks loose. Later that night, as the dorms fell into silence, Luke and Jake sat huddled together, their voices barely audible over the hum of restless breaths. "We need a distraction," Jake said, his tone resolute. Luke raised an eyebrow. "Something big enough to pull their attention away from us. But how?" Jake shook his head. "Haven't figured that part out yet. But we'll need more than just us to pull it off." Luke leaned back against the wall, his mind racing. Elias doesn't need to know about the girls. Not yet. The fewer people who know, the better. Jake hesitated, then nodded. Agreed. But he's right about one thing. We can use that prison to our advantage, if it's as vulnerable as he says. "It's a death trap," Luke interrupted. "If those things get out, they won't stop until they've killed everything in their path." Jake's expression hardened. "Better them than us." Luke didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the dark ceiling above. He couldn't argue with Jake's logic, but the thought of unleashing something so dangerous sent a chill through him. A guard barked the order, his tone sharp and final, and Jake obeyed without question. He wasn't sure why he'd been chosen, but when he arrived at the pet's chambers, the sight before him made his stomach churn. Lexi lay on a narrow cot, her fragile body covered in bruises and shallow cuts. Her breathing was faint, her lips cracked and dry. Maria knelt beside her, her hands shaking as she tried to clean the wounds with a damp cloth. "You're late," Maria said sharply, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. Jake flinched but said nothing, moving quickly to her side. "I came as soon as they called me," he muttered, setting down the supplies he'd been given. Maria looked up at him, her piercing gaze heavy with suspicion and exhaustion. "Gosh, she's worse today. They've been pushing her too hard." Jake glanced at Lexi, his chest tightening. "What happened?" "They said she wasn't fast enough," Maria replied bitterly, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "So they made an example of her." Jake clenched his jaw, his hands trembling as he began tending to Lexi's wounds. "They're monsters," he muttered under his breath. Maria's expression softened for a moment, but her tone remained guarded. "Do you still think we're not worth the risk?" Jake froze, his hand hovering over a particularly deep cut. He looked up at her, guilt flashing across his face. "You told him, didn't you?" Maria pressed, her voice low but insistent. Jake swallowed hard. "I did, and—" Jake hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Luke's hesitant. He thinks it's too dangerous." Maria let out a bitter laugh, her voice laced with frustration. "Of course he does. It's always easier to look the other way, isn't it?" "It's not like that," Jake said quickly. He's scared. For all of us." "And what about you?" Maria demanded, her eyes locking onto his. "Are you scared too?" Jake hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm scared of what will happen if we don't try. You and Lexi. You don't deserve this. None of us do." Maria's gaze softened, a flicker of something, hope, maybe, crossing her face. "Then help us, please. I'm begging you, Jake." Jake's throat tightened, and he looked down at Lexi, her frail body trembling beneath his touch. "We will," he said softly. "I promise." Maria exhaled shakily, her shoulders sagging with relief. But her expression quickly hardened again. "You have to convince him, Jake. If he doesn't agree, he'll agree," Jake interrupted, his voice firm. "I'll make sure of it." Maria studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes searching his face. "You're different," she said finally. "Not like the others." Jake looked up at her, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Maria hesitated, then shook her head. "It doesn't matter, just don't let me down." "I won't," Jake said firmly. Maria nodded, her expression unreadable, and turned back to Lexi, gently brushing a strand of hair from her friend's face. "She doesn't have much time left, Jake, if we don't act soon." Jake's chest tightened, and he nodded. "We will, I promise." The dormitory reeked of damp stone, sweat, and despair. Luke sat on the edge of his cot, his muscles aching from the day's labor. The flickering lantern cast jagged shadows across the walls, illuminating the tired, hollow faces of the slaves around him. The air was thick with unspoken fear, a constant companion in this house of nightmares. Across the room, Jake leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face hard as he watched the iron door. Any moment now the guards would bark their orders, and the night's torment would begin anew. When the door finally creaked open, it wasn't the guards who entered, but Michael, a wiry, sharp-featured slave whose every word dripped with malice. Behind him, several other slaves shuffled in, their expressions wary. "Rise and shine, pigs," Michael sneered, his voice carrying a grating edge. "Big night ahead. Pets need tending, and lucky you're the chosen ones tonight." Luke exchanged a glance with Jake. Neither moved immediately, but Michael's sharp eyes caught their hesitation. "Don't make me repeat myself," Michael snapped, stepping into the room fully. He kicked the foot of a cot where another slave lay curled, too exhausted to rise. "Up, you useless piece of meat. You think the masters will care if I leave you bleeding on this floor?" The man scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with fear. Satisfied, Michael turned his attention to Jake and Luke. "They're waiting," he said with mock sweetness. "The pretty little pets need their precious dresses, and you two get the honor of playing housemaids." Jake's fists clenched at his sides, but Luke placed a steadying hand on his arm. They couldn't afford to provoke Mikhail. Not now. As the group of slaves followed Michael down the dimly lit corridor, he glanced over his shoulder and added, "Oh, and just so we're clear, you screw this up, you're dead. Important meeting tonight. The masters don't want to see so much as a hair out of place. We've got high-ranking bloodsuckers coming in. Arch-vampires. Heads of departments. You know what that means?" No one answered. Michael sneered. "It means you're nothing. Less than nothing. One mistake and we're all on the menu. So you better make sure those pets shine." Luke's stomach tightened, and he could feel the tension ripple through the others. An important meeting meant heightened scrutiny, tighter security, and an even greater risk of punishment. When they reached the pets' chambers, Michael shoved the door open with unnecessary force. Inside, several pets stood waiting in various states of disarray. Their delicate frames were wrapped in thin linens, their expressions a mixture of fear and resignation. Maria and another pet Lex stood near the far wall, their fragile forms outlined by the dim lantern light. Lexi's trembling was almost imperceptible, but Luke caught it as she flinched at the sound of Michael's voice. "Well, well," Michael said, his lips curling into a cruel smile as his eyes scanned the room. "Look at this pathetic lot. You call yourselves pets? More like stray mutts." He moved to a petite girl with dark curls who stood nervously clutching her linen wrap. "What are you shaking for?" Michael sneered, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Afraid they'll notice you're useless even when you're dressed up?" The girl lowered her head, biting her lip to keep from crying. Michael laughed harshly and moved to another pet, this one a taller girl with striking blonde hair. "And you," he said, circling her like a predator, "don't get too comfortable. Just because they like your face doesn't mean you're safe. One wrong move and you're nothing but leftovers." Michael grabbed a dress from a nearby rack and tossed it at Lexi, the fabric smacking her in the face. "Here, try not to ruin it with your filth." Lexi fumbled with the dress, her hands shaking as she tried to untangle the material. Maria stepped closer to her, her movements protective, but Michael was quicker. "Oh, don't worry, princess," he said, smirking at Maria. "Your turn's coming. I've got something extra special for you." He pulled another dress from the rack, this one a deep red that shimmered in the dim light. He held it up mockingly. "Bet you think this'll make you look like a queen, huh? Hate to break it to you, sweetheart, but no matter how pretty the dress, you'll always be just another piece of meat." Maria's green eyes narrowed, a spark of defiance flaring in their depths. But she said nothing, her jaw tightening as she endured Michael's taunts. Other slaves moved quietly around the room, fetching water, combing hair, and helping the other pets into their dresses. The air was thick with tension, each movement calculated to avoid drawing Michael's attention. Michael lingered near Maria, his smirk growing crueler. "You think you're better than the others, don't you?" Maria didn't flinch. "I think you're wasting your breath. The slap came fast and hard, Michael's hand connecting with Maria's cheek in a sharp crack that echoed through the room. She stumbled but didn't fall, her defiance still burning in her eyes even as a red welt blossomed across her skin. "Enough!" Jake's voice thundered through the room as he stepped forward, his body tense with barely restrained fury. Michael turned on him, a twisted smile spreading across his face. "Careful, big man. Don't forget your place." Luke stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "Let's just get this done. The masters are waiting." Michael lingered for a moment, his gaze darting between Luke and Jake. Finally he stepped back, his smirk returning. "Fine, but don't think I'll forget this." With that, he stormed out, leaving the door ajar behind him. As soon as he was gone, Jake moved to Maria's side, his hands hovering uncertainly. "I'm fine." Maria cut him off, her voice sharp but not unkind. She turned to Lexi, helping her with the dress. "Let's just get this over with." Jake looked like he wanted to say more, but Luke placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward the rack of clothes. "Not here," he said quietly. "We'll deal with him later." Jake nodded reluctantly, his anger still simmering just beneath the surface. The clanging of iron gates rang through the dormitory, jolting the slaves awake. Luke sat up from the thin mat on the floor, rubbing the back of his neck as the heavy stomp of boots grew louder. A guard stormed in, his whip coiled tightly in his hand, his expression grim. "Get up!" he barked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "All of you! The arch-vampire has summoned a gathering, and guests from across the region are coming. You will scrub this mansion spotless, prepare food and blood offerings, and ensure everything is in place. Do not make me repeat myself." The slaves scrambled to their feet, fear evident in their every move. Luke exchanged a glance with Jake, who muttered under his breath, "Another damned show for their egos. Enough talking." The guard snapped, cracking his whip against the floor. "Move!" The mansion was alive with frantic activity. Slaves darted through the hallways, scrubbing floors, polishing silverware, and hauling supplies. In the kitchens, the air was thick with the smell of freshly baked bread and roasted meat, though none of it would ever touch the slaves' lips. Luke and a small group of slaves were assigned to the basement where the blood stores were kept. It was a cold, dimly lit room lined with shelves stacked with glass blood bags of varying shades. A guard hovered nearby, barking instructions. "Sort them by blood type first," he growled. "Then by the pets' ages. The youngest one's blood must be at the front. Our guests deserve the best." Luke set to work, his hands trembling slightly as he handled the cold, slick bags. The labels were handwritten, each one bearing a pet's assigned number, blood type, and age. He tried not to think about the faces behind the numbers, but it was impossible. He recognized some of the numbers' pets he'd seen in passing, their hollow eyes staring back at him. Careful with that. The guard snapped as Luke fumbled with the bag. "Sorry," Luke murmured, quickly placing it on the shelf. He worked methodically, separating the bags into neat rows. AB positive, O negative, A negative. The younger pet's blood had a richer, deeper hue, almost shimmering in the dim light. It made him sick to think of the vampires savoring it like a fine wine. By the time he finished, his back ached and his hands were stiff from the cold, but there was no time to rest. The guard ushered them back upstairs, where the preparations continued. In the dining hall, Luke joined another group of slaves scrubbing the floor. The room was a masterpiece of Gothic elegance, high vaulted ceilings with intricate carvings, dark wooden paneling, and a table so long it seemed to stretch into eternity. "Every inch of this room must shine," a guard barked, his eyes scanning the group. "If I find even a speck of dust, you'll pay for it." Luke dropped to his knees, a bucket of soapy water at his side, and began scrubbing the cold stone floor. Around him, the other slaves worked in silence, their movements hurried and efficient. As he worked, 2 vampires entered the hall, their voices low but clear enough for Luke to catch fragments of their conversation. "The resistance in the west is growing bolder," one said, his tone clipped. "They've attacked 3 caravans this month." "They're fools," the other replied. The arch-vampire is preparing the Legion to wipe them out. They won't last another week. Luke's hands paused mid-scrub, his heart pounding in his chest. Resistance. The word filled him with a cautious sense of hope, though it was tempered by the vampire's confidence in their destruction. He forced himself to keep working, but his mind raced. If there were people out there fighting back, maybe there was still a chance for something better, something beyond these walls. In the East Wing, Jake was among a group of slaves preparing the pets' chambers. The room was draped in luxury, silk curtains, plush cushions, and delicate glass vials of perfume. Each pet had their own designated space, a mockery of comfort that only underscored their captivity. Michael stood at the center, his arms crossed, his voice dripping with disdain. "You call this clean? I wouldn't let a feral sleep in here, let alone a pet." Jake clenched his fists but said nothing, focusing instead on his task. He arranged the cushions meticulously, his jaw tightening as Michael moved from one slave to another, hurling insults like stones. "Faster, you idiots!" Michael sneered. "The pets need to be dressed and ready, and for the love of blood, someone polish the feeding bowls. They look like they've been dragged through the mud." In an adjoining room, the tension thickened as Lord Baston, Maria's owner, loomed over her. Baston was tall and lean, with an unsettling elegance that belied his cruelty. His sharp features were framed by dark hair, and his piercing gray eyes held a permanent glint of malice. Ilya stood trembling before him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You've disappointed me, Maria," Baston said, his voice soft yet venomous. "Your appearance is underwhelming. How am I to present you to the arch-vampire when you look like this?" "I'm sorry, master," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. Bastion's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Sorry won't suffice." Without warning, he grabbed her arm, yanking her toward him. His fangs gleamed as they descended, their tips glinting with silver, a feature that kept the blood flowing longer, preventing it from clotting. Maria gasped as his teeth pierced her neck, her body tensing as he drank deeply. The room was silent except for the faint sound of her blood being drained, a sickening rhythm that sent a chill through Jake's spine. Bastion pulled away after what felt like an eternity, his tongue flicking over his lips as he savored the taste. Maria slumped to the floor, her skin pale and her breathing shallow. "Clean her up," Bastion ordered coldly, addressing the nearest slaves, "and make sure she's presentable this time. I won't tolerate another failure." As he swept out of the room, Jake rushed to Maria's side. She was barely conscious, her body trembling with exhaustion. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice was weak. Jake's fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wanted to scream, to fight, to make Bastion pay for what he'd done, but all he could do was help Maria to her feet and guide her to a chair. Michael's mocking voice cut through the air. "Look at her. Useless, just like the rest of them." "Shut your mouth, Michael," Jake snapped, his voice low but dangerous. Michael smirked, unbothered. "Careful, Jake. You're sounding a little too attached. They're just pets, after all. Replaceable." Jake turned away, his chest heaving with suppressed rage. The great hall of the mansion, cold and vast, was cloaked in an oppressive silence. Darkness hung in the air, disturbed only by the faint flicker of crimson torches casting jagged shadows along the walls. The arch-vampire entered first, his figure a monolith of power. His crimson robes whispered across the marble floor, and the air around him seemed to shiver. Though his face was timeless, his eyes held the weight of countless centuries, twin voids of malice and intellect. He was known as Valerius Duskborn, the first of their kind, a being so ancient that even the myths spoke of him with hushed reverence. His abilities were whispered legends, the manipulation of shadows, bending them to his will, and mastery of dark affinity magic capable of unraveling flesh or binding his enemies in chains of blackened tendrils. A katana rested at his side, its hilt adorned with ancient runes that pulsed faintly like a living heart. Behind him, the heads of departments flanked him like sentinels, each stepping into the hall with the grace of predators. Lord Malric, his sharp features impassive but his aura betraying the glint of cunning, walked with practiced ease. Beside him was Lady Alara Nightvale, a statuesque vampire whose porcelain skin contrasted sharply with the dark crimson gown she wore. Her pale hand rested lightly on her own katana, a blade rumored to have tasted the blood of an entire kingdom. Her reputation for commanding the coven's internal affairs with an iron will and cruel efficiency made her feared even among her peers. Close behind was Ephraim Calder, Maria's master. His presence was quieter but no less intimidating, his emerald eyes gleaming with amusement and malice. His silver-edged katana swayed at his side, a weapon stained with the blood of countless humans and vampires alike. 4 more heads followed, each distinct yet bound by the same ruthless aura. Cryos Valamir, a towering brute with alabaster skin and scars etched across his neck, his katana jagged and massive. Known for his strength and his ability to conjure crystalline barriers in combat, Cryos had crushed countless rebellions with sheer brutality. Saria Duskthorn, a lithe figure with jet-black hair that shimmered as if alive. She was known for her shape-shifting, able to assume forms as grotesque as they were beautiful. Her favorite was a monstrous hybrid of wolf and bat, a living nightmare unleashed on the battlefield. Draven Blackspire, a gaunt, silent figure cloaked in black. His telekinetic abilities allowed him to eviscerate his enemies with invisible force. His katana, thinner than the others, seemed to hum softly, as if craving the air of battle. Leora Vane, whose golden hair and deceptively angelic features masked a talent for weaving illusions. Entire armies had been led into traps by her spectral constructs, their minds too clouded to discern reality from the nightmare she spun. The hall was prepared to host not only the mansion's hierarchy, but also their guests, 11 arch-vampires, each the ruler of a distant region. As they entered one by one, their presence seemed to darken the very air. Valerius greeted them with the calculated respect of an emperor welcoming his warlords. Each bowed deeply, their movements fluid and unnervingly precise. Among them Lady Arundis Ashfall stood out, her alabaster gown soaked in dried blood, a macabre trophy of her latest conquest. Her katana was stained black, its power radiating even while dormant. She was known for her ability to turn her body to shadows, vanishing and reappearing at will to dispatch her prey. At her side was her head of region, Merrick Sunder, a hulking beast of a vampire. His katana was more akin to a cleaver, broad and vicious. Merrick's reputation for tearing apart his foes limb by limb was etched into the nightmares of the few humans who had survived his raids. The other arch-vampires and their heads followed, each one unique in both power and appearance. Among them were Azriel Thornweaver, with skin so pale it appeared translucent, his voice a haunting rasp that made mortals quiver. His ability to control the weather-summoning storms of blood rain was legendary. Kalina Mornave, whose delicate frame belied her savagery. Her affinity for ice magic had left entire regions frozen in time, their inhabitants locked in eternal screams of anguish. The introductions continued, each one more chilling than the last, until all 22 vampires, 11 arch-vampires and their heads stood assembled in grim silence. Valerius led them into the meeting chamber, a sprawling space at the heart of his quarters. The long obsidian table was adorned with crimson goblets and bloodstone carvings. A brazier at its center crackled with flames that burned black, casting sinister light across the faces of those seated. As the vampires took their places, the tension in the room was palpable. The weight of centuries of bloodshed, conquest, and betrayal hung thick in the air. Valerius rose, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the walls, and spoke with a voice that resonated through the marrow of every being present. "Welcome, my kin," he said, his lips curling into a predatory smile. "Tonight we convene not as conquerors or rivals, but as shepherds of this dark age. Let us discuss the future of our dominion, and ensure that no force, human or otherwise, will challenge the reign of the immortal."